Burren. We are delighted to have our most recent Farming for Nature ambassador, Bridget Murphy, join us. Bridget has 120 acres near to Dromard in County Sligo, half of which is commonage. She is primarily a sheep farmer, but also has beehives and ponies. Originally from South Africa, she arrived here about 20 years ago after she inherited some land in County Sligo. Bridget, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're delighted to have you. Can you hear me? Everything?
Thank you, Bridget. Yeah, no, that's great. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, perfect. Bridget, listen, you might just start with telling us a bit about the farm. What is your farming system and why you use the system?
Great, and I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to bump a bit of your screen here because I put a few photographs in just to kind of cheer things up a little.
Brilliant.
So let me just see if I can get it. There we go. So we've got a bit of a sideways picture here, but what you can see, the very, very large section would be the commonage that I share with 3 other people. The land down towards the right-hand side would be the greener fields, and the land that is mirroring along the commonage would have been part of a former commonage, the Alton-Elvec commonage. Which was divided up in the 1970s. So there's 3 different types of tenure playing out here. There would be commonage with shared ownership, there would be commonage in private ownership, and then there is freehold land, the greener land. Now I've just got to figure out how to keep moving these on. Okay, we seem to be having a bit of a technical glitch here. Bridget, do you know how I move the slides on? There we go.
Yeah.
Now, it's a bit difficult because the boxes that our faces are in are covering the greener land, the lower land of mine. But as you can see, there's a very, very, very direct transition between green fields and what we call mountain, which is not only relating to the height of the land, but it would relate to the type of vegetation that you find on the land. So literally from one fence to the next.
Bridget, can I just interrupt you there? Can you just take off your headphone and your speaker and just put it out to your computer quickly? I think it's just causing a bit of feed, sorry.
All right, how's that sounding?
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
All right, great. I've just lost my Britney Spears look. So as people can kind of see, there's very, very different vegetation that you work with when you're working with mountain. And that impacts very, very heavily on the type of farming you can do, the type of stocking density, and obviously the way you would use and manage it most effectively to keep it in a good condition. So thank you for the wee bit of the introduction there. And as you say, I came from South Africa. I was born there along with 4 sisters, and my parents came back in 1994 when the 2.
Sorry, Bridget, you have to unmute yourself there for some reason. Sorry.
Okay. How far have we gotten there?
You came back in 1994.
Oh, my parents came back in 94. I came and visited them in 98. And with the COVID now, it's quite interesting to explain this, but I had gotten black mold in my lungs, and it had triggered off a really, really rare medical condition. It's something very similar to farmer's lung, but the treatment for it would have been very high doses of steroids and chemotherapy. And what it meant was for 3.5 years, I had to self-isolate. And I did. I moved up a mountain, and I became quite a hermit up a mountain. So in some senses, the start of the whole environment, the whole nature side of this played into it, because I was able to take the time to look around me and see what was happening. So as I say, I grew up in South Africa. I went to university in South Africa in Pietermaritzburg. It's a bit of a joke in the sense that I always tell people that I studied anti-apartheid first and law second, but the late 1980s were those years that the apartheid government was desperately trying to hold onto the system. And I think I was 2 weeks into university when the first state of emergency was declared. So I went and got myself a law degree and decided to be of use to people who basically either could not get access to legal resources, or they were so far deep in the rural areas that there was nobody to go out and help them. So I joined an organization and I started working around land rights, land use, development, and I suppose that led on in time to issues of sustainability. Later on, I joined up with a fellow. We started a paragliding school. I had a daughter, Sky, and that was when I started learning about permaculture. We bought 30 hectares of land and we were looking at developing it or starting to farm it. And I got introduced to permaculture, and that was an incredible adventure. So just shortly after that was when I got the mold in my lungs, and I came to visit my parents for 3 months, and I found that the climate here in Ireland was incredibly good for all the lungs. So I decided to stay on. Dad put his back out. I said that I'd stay on until he was well. It turned out he had cancer of the spine, so he never did get back to taking over the farm again. So I suppose my adventure was never a really well thought out one. It wasn't a choice to come to Ireland and go farming. But I found myself being Bo Peep up a mountain with a flock of sheep that was a very, very old flock of sheep. I think some of them were 18 or 20 years old by that stage, because my great uncle at the time was 87. And I think he hadn't been swapping out many of his sheep at that stage. But anyway, so as I say, I inherited the mountain. And there was a track up there. There was a 6-foot track. There was no road, no electricity. There was a 5 by 5 meter shed with no roof on it. No house, absolutely nothing, except, as I say, a flock of very, very old sheep and some really, really bad fencing. So that was the start of the adventure, as I say. But going back to South Africa, one of the things that I took away with me was that at the time we were fighting apartheid, we were looking at issues of if people were able to get their land back, what were they going to do with that land? How were they going to be able to have livelihoods on that? How would it be sustainable? I think in those days we were talking about development. And there were really hard questions. The questions that would be, you know, how do you explain to people that there's not enough to go around for everybody to live this incredibly kind of wealthy lifestyle, or for everybody to have big houses and swimming pools, etc. And that when we had a look at what we had to work with, that if we were looking at redistributing land, if we were looking at making land available to people, we would have to look at a far simpler, a far closer to the ground set of solutions. The idea from a lot of the more political people was, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. Let's get rid of apartheid first, and let's start asking those more difficult, horrible questions later. And to some extent, I'm raising that because there's a massive regret, because by the time apartheid was done and we turned around and said, all right, let's start talking about development, let's start talking about sustainability, it was way too late. It was way too late. Practices that happened on the ground, things that moved on ahead, and quite honestly, South Africa is literally still trying to catch up with some of that disconnect. So I think that when we're looking at kind of what's facing us now, whether it be kind of globally, whether it be even within COVID, looking at food systems and how to make sure that they serve people better, we have to start asking some of the harder questions. How are we going to do that? What's that going to mean? Within the old capitalist system, there's always the idea that there's going to be winners and losers. And we know that, say, for example, dairy has been decided as a winner, and that some of the smaller, less viable farming would be losers. But I would like to say, if you have a look at the map in front of you, that the nature is playing out in the terrain, that some or most of the smaller farmers up and down the northwestern seaboard are sitting. So we're sitting with these very high nature value areas. We're sitting with the place where some of the last kind of wild parts of Ireland are still existing. And as I say, there's a whole lot of questions and discussions that need to happen around some of this. So I was just bringing that in to say that as I started exploring what I was doing. I started exploring using some of those harder questions as a starting point. So, sorry, your first question then was?
It would just, you know, maybe just tell us about your actual farming system and maybe season to season what that looks like, Bridget. You know, what goes on your farm, just the basic mechanics of it.
Sure, great. Well, let me see if I can move on some of these pictures now. So there you go. That was what I inherited, and it didn't have the roof on at the time that I inherited it. That was one of the first things I was able to do. It was the first shed and put a door on it. This would be looking down towards the sea and what I would call my greener fields and the greener land. There's this transition period from where the photograph is taken, and then on the next photograph, it shows you behind and all the way up to the top of the mountain. Now, my land would run up to those cliffs that you can see right up at the top. That would be on the commonage side. But the fence lines and everything run up there. And I'm only raising that because when I talk about fencing, you talk about putting 2 fence posts under your arm and you start hiking up that mountain, because there aren't roads and they don't get delivered off, unfortunately. Up on the mountain, you've got a diverse, kind of, as I say, a diverse set of species in the habitat that we would call mountain. You would have heather. This would be more towards the winter when everything is dark and dying off. But as I say, you can see within that, whoops, my land maintenance tools. These are my land maintenance tools. When I had to look at the stocking component for some of my land, I decided that the smartest thing to do would be to diversify the grazing regime, because the first thing that would happen is if I put all sheep on, sheep tend to only eat the same type of plants, and what happens then is that the stuff that they don't like starts to dominate the landscape. Ponies, and trust me, apparently my stallion is a bit of a second grade Connemara in him. He has blue eyes, hence his name Blue. But he came to me as a rescue, and he was given a mare, and he proceeded to have a pair of daughters. Now, they are wild up on the mountain. They do come down every day to get looked at and checked over, and then they head back up again. But they tend to eat a whole bunch of the stuff that the sheep wouldn't eat. They tend to crop away at the woody stuff. They tend to keep the heather nipped down rather than letting it get long and leggy. So there's something very, very useful about having a diversity of grazing regimes. Here are my sheep. I inherited a flock of the black-faced, the black horn sheep. But unfortunately, whenever they went up on the mountain, they seemed to just disappear. So I changed the flock out. I substituted them with the Chevets, and they seem to be a whole bunch more useful about sticking closer to home and not going walkabout. That was them yesterday. So I decided as well, because I was looking at trying to increase the amount of flora and fauna on the mountain. I came, as I say, from South Africa. So one of the things was I got this massive, massive fright. I kept looking around to try and see where the wildlife was. If there's any South African that is joined in, or anybody that was ever in South Africa, they would know that the moment you leave a bowl of sugar out, or if you leave even a crumb on a table, by the time you get back to that the next morning, it is covered in ants if the ants haven't actually taken it away. But it took me loads of time before I started even finding ant colonies on the farm. I couldn't find frogs. I couldn't find frog spawn. When I did find frog spawn, I started harvesting 1/10 of it, and I started putting it out into streams on the mountain. So bit by bit, and I was listening to Susanna the other night, and she was talking about how she built up her flock bit by bit. And I suppose that's exactly the way I've done this over 20 years. You literally take frog spawn from here and move it to there, or you would take certain plants and you would collect the seeds and you would shift them around. The bees then became quite useful, one because of the pollination, but two because they added another income stream onto the farm. So at the moment there's 8 hives, and these are my 5 nukes for this year. They would be splits from some of my bigger hives. And we all need to kind of keep our fingers very, very crossed that in the next couple of weeks we get well, I mean, in the next couple of days we get some dry days and some sunshine, because the queens need to get mated. So what I'd be looking at as a year on the farm, if we started off in winter, your daily chores would be feeding the sheep. And some days, well, some winters, not too often now, I think 2010, 11, and 15 and 16, we had the snow. After that, we would move into, well, I don't know why I say we, it's a royal we, because it's me. It's a bit embarrassing, yeah.
It shows how much hard work you do. Keep trucking.
So the lambing would generally start, now Uncle Tommy always started it just after Paddy's Day, but I generally tended to start it 3 or 4 weeks earlier, because I was even noticing at that point the weather patterns were starting to shift, and you were getting a better weather window over the sort of March and April, as opposed to the April and May. After the lambing, well, during the lambing, you'd start planting all the seeds, and then after the lambing, it would be time to start getting it all into the tunnel and outside the tunnel. So I'd be growing a whole bunch of stuff. As you can see, there would be sweet corn and pumpkins and beans and absolutely everything. And no more than that, I would have an entire garden outside. Now, the ponies pay rent. Their poop over the winter gets stacked in a pile, and I would be using last year's manure. This year's manure goes into a fresh pile to kind of rot down, to move on. I would also be using seaweed within that, and there would also be a whole bunch of kind of composting techniques that I'd use. I decided to have a diversity of potatoes, because when I decided to start putting my first potatoes in, somebody very kindly gave me a massive big sack of Lady Balfours. Now, Lady Balfours are a great organic potato in the sense that they are quite blight resistant, but let me tell you, you do not want to be eating 6 sacks of Lady Balfours over 1 year. You just lose the... I must admit, I lost the love for Lady Balfours. So I decided to start exploring different potatoes. And as you can see, these would have been different varieties that I would have planted, but I would have had ones for chipping and ones for mashing and ones for boiling. And I would have taken some older rare breeds, and I would have taken pink fir apples, are absolutely lovely, but I would have saved my own seed as well, and then used my own seed. Spring as well is when the bees start getting going, and you can always kind of see their pollen in the beginning would be loaded with the yellow, and the yellow is dandelion. So if I have any message that you ever have to say to people is, please stop spraying your dandelions with Roundup, because the bees end up landing on the dandelion and bringing the Roundup back into the hive, and contaminating both the honey and the feed. Now, the pollen is used for feed for the bees. This is you get excited in the spring when you start seeing this, when your queens have started laying eggs, and that kicks off the start of the bee season. So going through the summer, you would be very busy with the bees, with the vegetables, with the sheep. You would be doing your dipping, your dagging, your shearing. This is the haymaking. There would be 30 acres of thistles to be cut. In the beginning, I started with a scythe. I didn't even have a strimmer. I got very excited when I bought my first strimmer. And summer would also include things like stabilizing banks, because we're starting to see a lot more rain coming down in the showers that are coming down. And as you can see on the left, there's a whole section there that is about to break away into the stream. And on the right-hand side, the picture where there's already quite a lot of erosion happening. So what I would do is I would kind of get into the streams, collect a lot of the big rocks, and start packing them and building them back into the sides, and building back some of the walls that would have existed there to prevent the erosion. Summer also includes, in the beginning, you can see this slide was dated 2009. I was told that my fields were very, very boggy by my Chagas advisor, and that the drains needed to be opened up again. So I opened up the drains, and within 10 years, that's what they looked like. The drains had just closed themselves back up again, and that whole section of land was boggy. So one of the hard questions I had to start looking at was, did I start fighting nature and forcing that field to become something that I wanted to, which was a bit more grazing? Or did I acknowledge that nature was going to do what she did anyway? It was her system, and that I needed to understand the system that nature was using far more than the system that I was trying to impose on it. And so that would have been a start in terms of what became re-wetting of some of my land. This is another summer job, although I must admit I would generally tend to leave it into the autumn and into the winter because of the midges. You have no idea what it is like to try and work on a wall and be eaten alive by nasty little insects that I'm sure are just made of wings and mouth, because quite honestly, they have this most amazing ability to tear you to pieces. But that was the start of building my wall, and that was the end of building the wall, and that was reps. My plan had a pre-existing wall, and the 4 neighbors that used the road came together and we widened the road. So the wall got removed. They were able to put fences back. Unfortunately, I was called up for the fact that I needed to put my wall back in place. And that started a 2.5-year saga of learning to build stone walls and finishing the stone wall. But as I say, I did finally actually at the end of 2010 make it to the end of that. There were times that I couldn't stand up straight. And if we did have to look at health and safety, one person building a wall like that really wasn't, well, it kind of became great for my mental health afterwards. At the beginning, it really wasn't good for my mental health either. But another thing that I do a lot during the summer is that there's a lot of building. As I say, I inherited it with absolutely no infrastructure and no buildings. So that was my shed that was going up. And the second tunnel that I put up for sheep shelter, because I was finding when the sheep were feeding outside, in the winter, especially when we weren't getting hard frost, they were churning the ground over really badly. So I had to start feeding them undercover. I also started putting in some woodlots, and this went back to my permaculture days. I decided, and also there's an amazing book. If you haven't read a book called The Hidden Life of Trees, I would highly recommend it. But it explains the fact that if you are wanting a forest or even a copse to start developing in a natural way, going in with diggers and planting in stock circumvents a really important process that needed to happen before that. And that was where, as the small trees are taking root and starting to kind of spread out their roots, they start developing a whole world that lives underground. And I know that O'Connor, what's your man's name? Brent, help me out here. He's one of the ambassadors as well, but he spoke quite a lot about the composting and about the mycorrhizals and the fungi that you need to get healthy soils. Sorry?
Thomas O'Connor.
Thomas O'Connor, there you go. Sorry, Thomas. I could remember the surname and I couldn't remember the first name. But one of the approaches that I decided to take after reading The Hidden Life of Trees was that I wanted to dot copses across the farm, but put a full variety of species into them. And then if there was going to be further development of the woods or natural native woodland starting to spring up, that would actually be sourced and fed from what would be nursery copses or woodlots. So this was one of my first. Unfortunately, the Department of Agriculture had a look at it and decided it was called scrub, and it was deducted from my farm payment, and I was penalized for having it. So, there are times where you do feel that trying doesn't really help you out too much. Something else I would be doing in the summer would be collecting the wildflower seeds. Now, this is yellow rattle. A lot of people who would have meadows would be having hysterics to see it because it's parasitic on grass. But what it does is, as it parasites out your ordinary grass, it weakens it to the point which allows a whole lot of other meadow flowers to start popping up and taking the space. So every year I would harvest a whole bunch of it, collect the seed, and then go out and spread the seed into the different areas that I'd be working on. Summer includes fencing, and as I say, this would be sort of towards the top of my land now. It's called the Fox's Den. And as I say, fencing up there is a complete and utter labor of love. You have to put those fence posts under your arm and walk up the mountain. It takes 40 minutes to walk up. You drop them off, you walk down for 30 minutes because it's a bit quicker going down than coming up, and you take your next set of fence posts. That piece of fencing I did took 380 fence posts. So you can work out, I spent months and months and months walking up and down that mountain so that we didn't get penalized for reps for not having it fenced. You can see part of it running all the way down towards the lower land there. Coming into the autumn, you have chopping and stacking wood. Like I say, I would try and put in 150 to 200 trees every year. And then we have a lot of storms, we have a lot of wind, so there would be a lot of trees coming down, and those I would harvest and use for firewood. It would also be harvesting time for the orchard and in the vegetable in the tunnel, and you would start processing that for the winter. So this is my massive deep freeze, and as you can see, as the sweet corn came out, it would be processed and frozen. As your tomatoes came out, they'd either be roasted and frozen. But essentially, I would kind of go into the winter with a full deep freeze. I could also have lamb in that, although at this stage, I don't really eat lamb. I'll come on to that. But okay, here it is. I'll put it out there on the table. I'm a vegetarian. When I was on the treatment for the pulmonary fibrosis, scarring of the lungs, the chemotherapy, I wasn't able to digest meat. And I stopped eating meat for that period of time, and I never really was able to kind of get back into it. So as I say, there's my potatoes now harvested and all neatly labeled for the winter. So your chipping is great with your Maris pipers. You see the Lady Belfours are much smaller now in quantity, but the pink fir apple's absolutely amazing potato if you've never grown it. And then I would do a whole lot of experimenting. This was this year's experiment. Our wool has absolutely no value this year at all. There's no market for it. So I decided to start having a look and seeing what use I could put it to. And I built a whole bunch of vegetable containers for growing vegetables. And I layered wool and the compost and the manure, and the wool and the compost and the manure, and then just put a small layer of soil on top. And I also tested out my own compost, which is on the right-hand side, and using wool for sprouting. Now, using wool for sprouting actually didn't work unless you dye it black, because unfortunately, it being white, it didn't actually hold the heat that you needed. But the experiment with all of the others has worked out really well. So these are the beds now, a couple of months later. They have a skim over the top of them of compost. They have manure that came straight out of the tunnel that is right next door to it, and they have all the wool in it. So that would be that, I suppose. There would be a couple of more things, as I say. They would be making compost in the autumn. But it all depends a lot on weather and that. But everything on the farm is used. I try not to kind of have anything that goes off farm. I have the hay meadow down at my mum's that I use, so the hay would actually come up. But what I would try and do over a period of time is to return some of the compost back down to that area to replace that. But there would be a whole kind of circular system of using the resources.
Wow, yeah, Bridget, there's a lot of amazing dedication and hard labour you've kind of demonstrated there. Well done. Just to go back to the one thing, the bees, do you produce honey? I didn't see your stores of honey. I was just wondering, do you sell your honey, or what do you do with your bees?
Great. Technically speaking, I use the bees to increase the bees. So I would actually use their stores to increase the numbers. the smarter way, let's put it this way, if one wanted to have a look at making money off of bees, the smartest thing to do is to use honey as the cherry on the top. If you get a good year for it and you get a good honey year out of it, that's great. But you're not sitting relying and depending on it completely. Where people are doing that and you have a bad year like we've had at the moment with being too wet, the pollen has been soaked, and even when they do get time to fly, the temperatures have been so low that say, for example, you need 17 or 18 degrees for the clover to start releasing nectar. This year we haven't really had those temperatures, so there's a lot less of that about. If you were relying on honey, what you would do at that point in time is you would go and get a whole bunch of sugar, turn it into syrup. The bees would take the syrup down and they would make up, but it would not be honey, it would be syrup. So as I say, if I get a good honey crop out of a good honey year, then that's great. That would be additional income. But what I would do is I would look at what you'd be wanting to do for making money out of bees would be out of your nukes, selling on nukes to people who want to get into bees. Queen rearing, you would have a look at rearing a whole bunch of queens. I use Apis mellifera, which is the native black bee. So there's always, I mean, you'd be wanting to replace your queens every 2 years and maybe even sooner if you had a really bad year for mating. So there's always a market. There's always people who are looking to buy queens. And I think that's where it becomes a whole bunch smarter to put your business making into that type of a section. And as I say, use the honey for building the expansion of the bees. And then if you do have a surplus on top of it, I actually allow the bees to carry their honey in the hive through the winter. And when it comes to the spring, if they have stores that they haven't used, I'll remove those and use use that. But if it's a delayed spring, when we had the beast from the east, I lost eight hives in that because they starved to death. It was just that the spring had been extended, and at exactly the same time they needed to get out and start bringing in nectar and pollen, there was absolutely nothing there, so the hives starved. But like I say, I'd rather look for the money making to come out of the queens and out of the nukes rather than out of the honey. And a good honey year is just a bonus.
And just another question there, based on the photos you just showed us. How old are those coppices, those woodlands that you've planted?
Great. That one was planted in 2015.
Okay.
Now, the mixture, it would be birch at the bottom, ordinary birch, silver birch, and I had some weeping birch as well. And then it would go into alder, it would go into ash, and then it would go into willow, and then it would have been underplanted with things like holly, blackthorn, whitethorn, a bit of rowan, the mountain ash to the side of it. And I planted it in such a way that there were some really old mature trees in the hedgerow, which would have provided the sort of mother function for the growing copse.
Okay, and two questions. One is, when will the department see that as non-scrub? And then the other question is, do you do grazing amongst it? Do you practice agroforestry, I suppose, at all, or do you graze the sheep amongst the trees?
Well, not the copses at the moment, because like I say, they what they would be for me is a nursery, a store of seeds that are going to come out. So they are quite closely planted together. The stronger ones will outcompete the weaker ones. So if you were putting an agroforestry right now, you would literally go in and plant according to spacings. You would put in those trees. So natural selection hasn't taken place. Do you know what I mean? You've kind of selected and whatever. I'm allowing, say, for example, natural selection to take place here, resilience for things like the ash, if the ash dieback and whatever, you'd be wanting to build that in. So I wouldn't graze in the nurseries, the nursery woodlots, but certainly as the trees kind of, and I'm going to see if I can go all the way back here to having a look at the farm. You can see I've got all of my fields have trees either lining them or around them, and all of my water, the water courses, let's have a look here. Actually, just where our pictures are is where you'd be able to see it. But I've lined, all the water courses were lined previously by somebody in my family. And what I've done is, as the trees have died and fallen out of it, I've kind of planted them back in. So there would be quite a lot of sort of freestanding wood there already that the sheep do in between. And certainly, I mean, when you watch these ash trees coming into leaf, you watch the sheep dancing underneath, because they'll be standing on 2 feet as they kind of like busy feeding away.
Mm-hmm. Great. I recognise that we need to allow time for other people to ask questions. So
Sure.
I might just ask one last question, and I can see that your next slide was going to deal with it anyway, but you might just quickly give us an overview of what you've done quite nicely anyway, but what you deliberately do for nature or continue to do for nature.
Okay, well, like I say, I mean, the first thing when I got there was realizing that I couldn't see nature. I couldn't see animals or insects or whatever. So one of the first things I started doing was learning to, one, identify the type of ecosystems that the farm was sitting in, what type of flora and fauna would be found within those different ecosystems, and what they needed to thrive within that. So for example, as you can see on the left was some of the woodlots starting up. In the middle would be one of the places where I'm harvesting seed for going back into the hedgerows or going back into the margins. And there's a slide here that, as I say, we're covering most of it, but it would be a patch of nettles that this year just hatched out the most phenomenal amount of caterpillars. So it's going to be interesting to see what type of butterfly comes out of that. But essentially, I started off, now I'm a bit of a researcher as well, or I kind of love research. So the first thing, as I said, was to get those ecosystems thriving, was to start providing the appropriate habitat, planting the trees, the woodlots, planting the food for the different species. I started using the waterways as a corridor to start linking the habitats. So all the habitats are actually linked in some way or another to each other. And as I said, I started allowing some drains to start blocking, and I allowed some of the wetter areas to start coming up. I allowed some ponds to start coming back in. I made an effort to start seeing what was around me, and I think that this is what I'm going to show you here. In 2008, I started a photo diary. It was in the days when phones started having cameras, which was just the most amazing invention. No, seriously, it was, because, you know, you never really carried your camera around with your really good camera, but you always had your phone on you. So even if some of these photos, you'll see the quality of them isn't great, every time I see something, and I've done this now over from 2008 till now, so I have a 12-year sort of eco diary of seeing who shares the land with me. So when I'm out and about and I see something, I'll take pictures. So I start taking pictures of when do the swallows arrive and when do they leave? What type of ladybirds do I have? And how many different species do I have? You must admit, this is an amazing picture. This is a pregnant mouse. I mean, I've never seen a mouse. Honestly, she was so pregnant she couldn't run. Okay? That's why it was easy to kind of take the picture. But if you take your time and you look around, you start seeing things. Now, I've built a shed, I've built 2 tunnels, I've kind of put in a whole bunch of infrastructure for the farm. The only thing I haven't got is a house for myself. I'm still living in a very old mobile home that lets in a whole bunch of wildlife itself. So I have bats that I have to keep throwing out. This fella moved into my laundry pile the one day. And I went on holiday for my 50th birthday to South Africa for 2 weeks, and I came back and a pine marten had moved in and literally, block your ears, made shite of my place. But as I say, as I'm out and about, I'll be taking photos, because what I'm wanting to see is what I've got on the farm, where it is. Do you know what I mean? If you can see within the circle, I was working late one night in the tunnel, and I kept getting the feeling that something was watching me. So I put my phone on flash and I took a picture, and there's a wee little field mouse down there, and he's busy harvesting the seed from the white borage while I was busy harvesting. This isn't one of my photos. A friend, Kieran Davis, took this. I had cleared the land for planting the potatoes and I'd left the spade in the field. I went down to collect the spade and found these 4 leverets waiting for the hare to come and feed them in the middle of the night. So it was a lovely picture. But I have a lot of hares. So one of the things that I have done deliberately for nature as well, no pets, no cats. I still have a cat that is hunting on my land, which is a real pity because she does wipe out stuff. But these are just the pics, as I say, when you're walking about. I nearly stood on this nest, bent down to have a look, and obviously they thought I was their mother. This is the sundew up on the commonage, up on the mountain. So you've got your sphagnum moss and you've got the catchers. I just put a few of the plants in and whatever, because honestly I could have thrown loads of slides out on that. I mapped all my badgers. I have a load of badger sets, and I don't know if anybody's ever done any research on badgers, but badgers tend to use the same sets, older sets. It would be like moving into somebody else's kind of like house. They would just clean it out and carry on using it. So some of these Irish research kind of takes it that they could go back to sort of 10,000 years old. But what I did was I mapped all of the badger sets on my land and the connection between them. Now, this badger, I must admit, it was a dreadful, dreadful, dreadful night the night before. It was a storm of note, and that badger must have been out in it and decided that she wasn't even going to head home. So she just curled up in the tunnel, made herself comfortable, and went to sleep, and woke up and carried on the next day. We had an orphan fox. Its mother had been run over, and it was still there. So we caught fleas, but we did manage to get it defleed, and then we rehabilitated it back out on the farm. So we didn't bring it inside and turn it into a pet, but basically we fed it cat food and allowed it to kind of like get stronger until it was able to make its way out in the world. There's also horrible things that you don't want to see on your farm. Underneath my bales of silage, if you can see on the right-hand side, the New Zealand flatworm, breaded New Zealand flatworm, which has made its way onto my farm. Whether it came in under these bales, I don't know, but it has spread quite a lot. Going around this time of the year and taking photographs of mushrooms, and wow, there's just the most incredible kind of like fungi on the mountain. And then the birds and the bees. Now, I only kind of used a couple of bee pictures, but the one in the middle you can see as well is full of mites. So, you know, I was chatting to somebody and they were saying they didn't even know that varroa attacked the bumblebees. But when you're having a look at photographs like that, you can start seeing that these things do happen. And then the butterflies. And as I say, there is my biggest threat to my wildlife, is my neighbor's cat, who spends her time chasing most of the leverets and the birds and the small stuff.
That's really fascinating. I think it just shows the importance of keeping a record, you know, things that you might see every day and you might forget that you have, but also the kind of keeping record of the unusual and stuff as well. Just really quickly there, Bridget, I'm going to stop sharing your screen because there's a few questions coming in. Sure. And I actually got one emailed during the week. So this is from a Loretta Nuri. Any advice how to conserve the native bee, Bridget, given the increase of imports of non-native bees that is happening now, which causes our bees to become hybridized and then aggressive?
Okay. I mean, on one level, you did right. I mean, we need to do everything we can to protect the native Irish bee, and it is incredibly resilient for our weather. I mean, it's native, so therefore it has the resilience. It's bred to the flora and fauna. On another level, it's kind of like trying to buy a ticket after the ship has sailed, because once the other bees are in, there is going to be the chance of hybridization and the crossbreeding. Although if you have a look, I mean, the research is out there and the research has been done that you've got hives that are up to 95% pure black bee, which means that there is certainly a little bit of selection, once again, that nature makes herself. And I think that that's quite important. So I would raise anybody that is getting into bees, I would love to say, look, I'm not being how would you say, judgmental. But if you can choose to take mellifera, I would. My starting point with bees was with buckfast. I was given a few buckfast hives. I requeened them black, and I went black that way. But in terms of that, one of the things that I've been looking at trying to do over the last number of years is to have a look at bees being classified a livestock unit, so that we could actually start moving some of the sheep off some of my fields and allowing all of that flowers to come back, which of course the sheep just wipe out. I mean, if you have sheep, you don't have flowers. And within that would be something where you would want to say, all right, well, let's try and see if we could do it using the native bee, and try it that way. But as I say, I mean, beekeepers, it's very contentious among beekeepers. Whoever's got their bees know more than the different types of breeds you would have of cattle. Some people would swear by a Belgian blue, and somebody would look at it and say, I mean, it's been tweaked to within an inch of its life, and that shouldn't be happening. But we can't at this stage tell farmers what to do in terms of livestock. But I think that we can, if we really are wanting to farm for nature, farm where the resilience is, farm where the natural practice is, farm where the native animal is, and work it that way and go with the black bee.
I was actually going to ask that question, and then and I know Brendan has a question for you then after, but the question is, like, if you wanted to get support and advice to farm for nature, I'm just talking about if a farmer anywhere in Ireland, where would you suggest that people go? Where did you get your support and advice, I suppose? You know, or is it just kind of tried and tested method, you know, or would you have any suggestions for people?
All right, well, mine was a little bit weird, as I say, because I started back in South Africa and I was introduced to Findhorn and permaculture, so that would have been my entrance kind of point. I then read every single book I could find, and then audio books, and then thank God this thing called broadband came along, which allows you to kind of both find research on the internet, but also find groups. And there are loads of groups out there. There's loads of bee groups out there. There's loads of groups around regenerative farming, soil for nature, soil for farming. You know, there's this amazing amount of people starting to talk and network about stuff. So I'd say if you are interested, find one or two of those groups, link into them, because especially around the bees, people are really, really, really happy to share their knowledge and to give and to kind of pass on. And not just the knowledge, they'd be passing on if you needed a queen in a hurry, or if you were stuck, or there's advice, there's support. It's well worth finding some of those groups online and joining them.
Brendan, do you have a question there you were saying for Bridget?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me, Bridget, but that was absolutely wonderful. And I can't wait to read the book. There's definitely a book in you yet. I think it's wonderful, the record you have over time and the stories you have to tell, but of a personal and professional nature, I think are fantastic. So thank you so much. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. I just had a few kind of practical questions, and I'm interested in some of the habitats I've seen there, particularly the grasslands, wetlands and the hedgerows. How do you manage in terms of the grazing regimes? Because I know you're aiming for species-rich meadows and you've got some nice yellow rattle. How do you manage the grazing regime with the sheep in order to do that?
I really battle, that's to be honest. Using the commonage of it is very, very, very difficult. So most of my sheep generally tend to stay on my half of the farm, you know, the half that isn't the shared land, which generally means I tend to be overstocked on one side and understocked on the other. Now with GLOS, they put the GLOS management plan in, and my stocking density would be 24. Thank goodness I'm able to use the ponies because they've been there for over 10 years as the grazing regime there. But going back to the grasslands, I'm stuck. I mean, I'd love, and that's why, again, I'm saying things like, I would love to kind of take the 75 sheep that I had and cut them down to 30 and put in 30 beehives and put in something else and have a diversity of livestock so that there would be less of a demand from the sheep to the grass and more of an ability to kind of like allow other stuff to come up and as I say, you know, I mean, I go and sow stuff and the sheep will be mowing it out behind me, but that is kind of like a particular problem when you have sheep.
And just to clarify for people, the reason you feel you have to keep those sheep is because basically a lot of your payments depend on having those sheep on the mountain.
Okay, yeah, for people who have no idea of CAP, let me explain one thing, and I would love it if people could kind of get involved and take some of this up. So CAP is Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is direct support to farmers. Pillar 2 would be your rural development. And under the rural development would come all of your environment, your eco schemes, and things like LEADER and other rural development projects and things. Now, under Pillar 1, a reference period was 2000, 2001, and 2002 was was the EU reference period. The number of stock people had at that time was what they were paid out from 2004 up to 2014. The difficulty there, once 2014 came, they said, all right, they were going to decouple, which means that you get paid the same amount of money, but you don't have to keep the same amount of stock. But my direct payment was very, very low. It was 1,360 a year, which, let me tell you, doesn't do much in the way of fencing, let alone any of the other stuff I've been talking about. Under Pillar 2, I would have been able to get 8,000 under reps, which then became 5,000 under AOS or GLOS, but it would be a very, very big source of income for me. And the second big source of income for me would be the areas of natural constraint. You get paid a bit extra because of the extra cost and the fact that you can't make as much off that land that we saw at the top of the mountain. The downside of both of those is that you have to keep a certain stocking density. So there's no stocking density for getting your direct payment, but there's a stocking density to get your environmental payments. And unfortunately, the only stock that sits there at the moment would be cattle, sheep, the registered broodmares and whatever that you would be having a foal off every single year. And donkeys used to be on that, but they've been taken out. So it's a bit crazy. It seems a bit back to front that for the one that's about producing the meat and the production, there's no livestock, what would you call it, that you have to keep a certain amount of livestock, but under the environmental ones you do. So unfortunately, I have to keep, at this stage, 54 sheep to be able to draw down my environmental payments.
And Bridget, just a quick question because we're short on time. If you had an environmental scheme which would pay you for the delivery of environmental outcomes for species-rich grasslands and for, et cetera, how would you change your system from what it is at the moment? You'd get rid of this?
Well, I wouldn't get rid of them completely, but I would put them into a place where they were in balance with my system. So say, for example, I mean, you have a look at regenerative farming, and there's amazing stuff that's happening around this, and if anybody hasn't heard of regenerative farming, find the Facebook group, join it up. I mean, there's amazing people in that with knowledge. But as I say, I mean, one of the things you would have to do is move your animals on. You would graze something quite tightly, and then you would shift them to a new piece of ground, and they would not come back to the piece that they'd grazed for at least 50 to 60 days. There's no way I can divide that mountain up into tiny little parcels and try and keep pushing sheep round and round that way. So if there was going to be something, there would have to be that give and take that allows the farmer to put their system into balance. And mine is out of balance at the moment, unfortunately.
That's driven by policy, unfortunately, as well. So I think it's a really important point. Bridget, as was the point earlier about where do you find the information, sometimes it can be difficult, but you've got a good ability as a researcher, so I think you've uncovered some really good resources to help you along the way, but I think that's another challenge for a lot of farmers. I want to hand you to Bridget, Barry, just in a second, but I'd just like to round off by saying, Farming for Nature is all about giving farmers a voice and allowing farmers to tell the broader public what they do for nature on their farms day in, day out, to share their experience and their knowledge. And I think, Bridget, you really embody all of that. I mean, you're a classic Farming for Nature ambassador in that regard. You speak so well, you speak so knowledgeably, you obviously put the hard graft in, but you're very eloquent in terms of telling the story. So thank you so much. I found it fascinating tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
Much. And Bridget, maybe back over to you for the last couple of there's a few questions I think you might need.
Yeah, thanks very much, Brendan. Exactly, you've been really inspiring, so thank you, Bridget. There's a lot of Bridget speaking tonight, so it's a bit confusing. But just really quickly there, Bridget, one of your questions is, one of the ladies wanted to know, did you use seed or bare root when planting your trees?
All right.
You grow your trees from seed or bare root, sorry, is from a Patrick.
Okay, so it would have been a little bit of a mixture. My hedgerows are an amazing place for me to be gathering tree seedlings. So come spring, or at least kind of like late into the spring when everything is sprouting, that's when I go out and I would collect them literally as they've started to put down that root. In the past, I kind of like left them out in unprotected, but my hares managed to kind of like literally trim them all down to nothing. So I did learn that I had to kind of like plant them, fence them off completely from things like the hares and whatever, and then let them grow up. So it would be from seed that has fallen from my own trees or trees nearby, that I'd be principally using. Although I've been very, very lucky over the years. Temple House has an amazing wood. I think they've got something over 600 hectares of wood. And they very kindly allowed me to go there on the odd year and go collecting seedlings and seeds for planting.
Okay, so a lot of people have kind of commented how much they really liked your photos, and thank you for sharing your farm, and even people that haven't seen you for a while. So I'll pass on those messages to you. Someone has mentioned that it would be a great place for study trips, Mary Mulvey. And Matthew has asked, have you had any issue with potato blight?
Yeah, and actually the Lady Balfour seemed to skip it, but really it didn't inspire me to kind of like plant it all over again. Yeah, I did. I use a little bit of the bluestone, trying to the older remedies rather than anything kind of too toxic. But sometimes you did. There was a year or two I lost everything, but I would tend once again to, if I see something getting blighted, I would pull it and hope that whatever kind of got left behind in the different rows either built up a resilience or had some sort of a tolerance.
Okay, perfect. And if people wanted to contact you directly, Bridget, are you on social media? How do people find you?
Yeah, I told you I was a hermit, so I really did. I mean, I've been battling over these last few years to put myself out on things like LinkedIn or I did get onto to Facebook, and apparently there are a couple of million Bridget Murphys out there, so that's not much use for people. But yeah, I should have put my email there, but it's bridgetmurphy@gmail.com.
I can type it in there, BRIDGIE.
BRIDGI, yeah.
Okay, Murphy.
Oh, no dots. Bridget
No
Murphy.
dots, sorry, Bridget Murphy.
At gmail.com.
Okay, so I've sent that in, so people can contact you directly if they have questions. Great. Listen, Bridget, I only have one last question for you, and then we'll close up. If you were to give like one piece of advice to every farmer in Ireland, or one top tip, no pressure, what would that be?
It's actually really, really easy. Stop seeing your land as a factory floor producing commodities, because start seeing your land as a piece of a living organism. Nature has systems and ecosystems. Learn what they are, restore them, start mimicking them, because if we have a thriving, healthy environment, we'll have thriving, healthy communities and thriving, healthy economies. But if our environment had to tank and collapse, the economy and the communities are not far behind them. So one of the ways to do this is to stop looking at your farm as a factory and using it as a production. My daughter went and did her green cert down at Paliskenry, and they were talking about fields, calling them, what do you call it? Sorry, the animals were economic units and the fields were grazing platforms. But you start taking out what's living and real in that. Start looking at your land again, start really looking at it and start seeing it for what it is, because it really is.
I think that's a really nice end to our entire Ask the Farmer Q&A session. So thank you for that. That's kind of rounded it up. A nice big top tip there. And listen, you've been your contribution has been amazing. What you've managed to achieve is really inspiring. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your knowledge. And I suppose hopefully giving others something to think about in terms of how they farm. You know, it's great to have people like yourself speaking up for nature, so thank you for that. And incorporating it into your farming practices, obviously. So if any of our audience knows someone who missed tonight and would like to see it, a recording of this session will be up on YouTube probably by tomorrow afternoon. So I'll be sharing that link on social media. So feel free to pass it on to anyone who you think would like to see this great session. So that's great. And then that brings us to the end of our Ask the Farmer Q&A sessions for this season. We'll hopefully be back again in autumn time or winter time, but we do have lots coming up, including farm walks and lots of different kind of information. So subscribe to us, join us on social media, listen to our podcasts or watch our videos. There's a lot there. But meanwhile, thank you, Bridget. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for completing our Ask the Farmer Q&A session. And thank you to all our audience for joining us. So until next time, goodbye. Goodbye.